I want to take just a minute this morning before you watch this sermon or listen to this sermon to acknowledge a couple of inaccuracies in this sermon. I veered from my notes and I said some things that weren't true. First of all, I said in the sermon that stars do not emit light. I was corrected today and realized that stars do emit light, so you'll have to excuse my ignorance there. I think I also used the word astrology instead of astronomy. So with those two bits of information, I was getting off my notes and saying things that I really didn't know much about. So I didn't want to throw this out on the internet without correcting those two mistakes. Hope you enjoy the sermon.
Okay, he's going with you. Okay. So you guys make your way over there. All right. Thank you, guys. Werner Jack Ganot wanted to be a hero. So he concatenated a story about being a war hero, fighting a battle in the Korean War and being taken as prisoner of war, and it was all made up. He's now 71 at the time of this article in a small town in Illinois where he serves as an alderman. His story grew until his uniform that he wore on special occasions became laden with fake medals that he ordered from a catalog. Bronze Star, Silver Star, and 2 Purple Hearts. He would march in parades and he would talk to school children. He even got a special license plate for disabled veterans by forging papers. However, a Veterans League eventually noticed a lack of records on file and numerous factual holes in his story and began an investigation. For 2 years, he denied the accusations, danced around the questions, but finally he confessed to a local newspaper, saying that he could no longer stand the facade. He said, "You can't imagine what I'm going through," he said. "I really didn't know how to shake this demon, but I went to bed with it every night and I looked at it in the mirror every morning." He said, "I don't want to meet my Maker with this in my heart." Jack was pretending to be something that he was not. And in this week's text, as we open our Bibles together this morning and we read from Matthew chapter 5, Jesus challenges us to be authentic in our faith. And if we are authentic in our faith, we will impact the world around us. Now, I said last week, and I'll say it again this week, perhaps the most dangerous Bible passages are those that have the greatest familiarity. Wouldn't you agree? Because we hear them, and I've heard this before, right? I've heard this story, I know this text, and it just kind of flies over our head, doesn't it? But this morning, and this is a familiar text, isn't it? One you've probably heard, at least most people in this room have heard this preached at least once, right? To be salt and light in the world. So let me challenge you this morning before we dive in to pretend that you've never heard this before. To try your best to open your ears, to hear it as if you're hearing it for the first time. Imagine with me the teacher, Jesus, standing on a hillside with an early group of followers. They were trying to figure out what this kingdom was supposed to look like. And do you remember last week we kind of began this, Jesus unpacked, those who are blessed, we said. This is what the kingdom looks like. And they want to know what the kingdom is going to look like, how they're to act in the kingdom, and what's going to happen in this kingdom. So let me also back up just a bit and talk about the text last week. And let's tell you what, we're going to read this text before we do that. And then we're going to back up, just kind of rehash a little bit of what we talked about last week, and then move into the text this week. So I'm going to invite Katie Braswell to come this morning and read Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 20. And let me invite you to open your Bibles to that text and then leave it open after Katie is finished as we study it together this morning.
Matthew 5:13 through 20. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter nor the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven.
All right. Thank you, Katie. Now, just remembering just a bit what we talked about last week, we talked about these blessings that Jesus said that we would be blessed if he listed a few of those. And you remember last week we said, these are not the things that I would imagine would be blessed, right? In fact, Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, right? He says, blessed are those who mourn for what is right. Blessed are the meek, in contrast to the powerful. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are those who show mercy instead of giving people what they deserve. Blessed are those who are persecuted. I don't know about you, but this isn't the list that I would want to follow if I was going to be blessed, right? These are things that many times I think you're not blessed if you are these things, but Jesus turns it around. And it's in this vein that Jesus says, now, if you can learn to live like this, if you can learn to function in this sort of kingdom, this is going to happen next. And Jesus says to his followers, you are, first of all, what does he say? The salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. Now, you've probably heard this text before. Maybe you've heard it preached. And there's a lot of different ways that you could apply this whole deal of salt, right? Now, if we kind of back away from it and we think of salt in our world, many of you are thinking of the salt shaker on the table, right? But salt was a very different and served a very different purpose in the first century. You see, it's a much broader purpose. Salt was used for all sorts of things. But first of all, salt was used to preserve because they didn't have refrigerators, they didn't have freezers, and if you killed an animal, you could consume it all in one place if you had lots of people, but otherwise you had to preserve it, right, to save it for days ahead. Otherwise it would rot. And so what would they do? They would take salt and use that salt to preserve the meat. Now, you might have been to Cracker Barrel, right, and had the ham that's real salty like that, and you kind of know that. Maybe even your grandparents would tell you about how they used to preserve meat. But most of us in our world today don't use salt in this way anymore, right? Most of us has freezers or refrigerators that we use. So you might apply this, and you might say, well, Jesus is saying to us, if we are the salt of the earth, we are preserving a rotten and decaying world, right? So that's one application of that. Salt also adds flavor, and many of you, if you eat lunch today, you'll take salt and put it on your food because you want your food to taste a little bit better, right? And so you might apply this, and you might say, well, maybe Jesus is saying of us that we are to add flavor to a dull world. I think that's kind of a shallow application, but that could be one application of the text. Salt was also a purifying agent. And is a purifying agent, right? If you've got an infection or something, many times you'll gargle with salt or put salt in a wound to help, right? Because it heals and it purifies. So maybe Jesus is saying of us that we are going to be a purifying agent to the world in which we live. We're going to bring healing to the world in which we live. Maybe that's what he's getting at there. Again, there are many ways to look at this. Finally, one application that you may not know is that they would take salt and they would put it in lamps and ovens in the first century to increase the efficiency of the lamp. So the lamp would burn brighter if it had salt in it. Now that would make sense, right? That Jesus says you're the salt of the earth, then you are the light of the world. Those two go hand in hand. And when you would put salt in an oven, the oven would burn brighter. It would increase the efficiency of the oven. So maybe Jesus is saying of us, if we are the salt of the earth, we are going to have impact in the world. We're going to make it a brighter place, right? We're going to add to it in that sort of way. There's all sorts of ways to look at it. But Jesus says you are the salt of the earth. Now, if we back away from the text a little bit, and we just say, well, we're not going to try to figure out every way in which this applies to us, but we just look at what Jesus is saying here. Notice what he says. You are the salt of the what? Earth. Now, too often as Christians, we think it's all about heaven, right? And we're just kind of in the waiting room now until we get to heaven. It's all going to be about heaven, right? But Jesus says, no, you are the salt of the earth. You have impact not only in heaven, but in the world in which you live right now. And so I think that's what we're getting at this morning. Jesus is telling that early group of followers that they are crucial to the earth, to the world in which they live. And look what he says next. He says, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? Now you might be reading this and going, what's he getting at there? What's he saying there? And if you're a chemist, you might know that sodium chloride is a very stable compound. In fact, chemists will tell you that salt can never not be salt. Okay? Salt will always be salt. Sodium chloride, you can't take the salt out of salt in that sense, okay? It's very stable, but here's one thing about sodium chloride. It can become contaminated, okay? And if it becomes contaminated and it loses its saltiness, it's not useful anymore. In fact, it's detrimental. Did you know that if you take contaminated salt, you cannot even put it in the compost pile because it will destroy the land? It has a very negative effect. And I think this is what Jesus is getting at here. People understood that. You see, rabbis in the first century, when they taught, they would use illustrations, things that people could understand. So if you're living in the first century and Jesus says, the salt, if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? Everybody knows that, right? Because they know once salt becomes contaminated, you can't do anything with it. You can't even bury it. Can't even put it in the compost pile. It's not even fit to put out in the manure. You can't do anything with it. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at here. He says what? It is no longer good for anything, you see. You might even say that contaminated salt is worse than if it were never salt at all. You see, we're tracking with me here. If you're a Christian and you're contaminated, many times you can do more damage to this world than help the world. So Jesus is describing his followers as having tremendous impact. And again, he says, if the salt loses its saltiness, if it is no longer good for anything, and then look what it says here, except to be thrown out by men. Now, Jesus, again, is a first century rabbi. And first century rabbis would often take things. If you notice, a lot of Jesus' lessons had to do with flowers and birds of the air and things that he would have taken right there. And Dr. David Turk says that if you walk in the region here of Israel, particularly in Jesus' day, there is a salt inside of the dirt of the ground. And most people in Jesus' day wore sandals, right? And he says, very likely, if you walk along with sandals and you look down with your sandals, your feet would be covered with dirt and with salt. Dirty salt, contaminated salt. And I kind of picture Jesus maybe teaching his followers and maybe even reaching down, pulling his sandal off and maybe wiping a little bit of the salt onto his finger and saying, if you're contaminated, you're going to be thrown out and what? Trampled by men. You see, that's what he's getting at there. Salt isn't good for anything. It's useless. It's worthless. Now, salt in its best is very useful, isn't it? It preserves the world. It purifies the world. It has a tremendous impact on the world. But if it loses its saltiness, if it loses who it is and what it is, it's useless. And I think that's what Jesus is saying here this morning. Another text this morning that I want to look at is a text from Isaiah chapter 58. This is the other lectionary text this morning. This is the prophetic text and the lectionary text. And as I was reading it this morning, it has tremendous application to what Jesus is saying in Matthew 5. I just want to read some of these verses for you. Isaiah says this, for day after day they seek me out. He's talking about the people of God here. They seem eager to know my ways as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. He's talking about the people of God here, and he says, look, they're doing all the right and religious things here. They're like Jack in our story this morning, pretending to be what they are not. They act like they're asking God to come near, but we keep reading here, and they're wondering why God is not impressed. Look at verse 3. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? What's up, God? We're going through all the right rituals. We're coming to church. We're singing the songs. We're enduring the sermon, right? We're doing all the right things. But God, you don't seem to be moving. You don't seem to be showing up. And look at verse 3. Yet on the day of your fasting, which is a religious experience there, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. See, you really don't reflect the real deal, he says. You're doing one thing at church, and yet you're doing something else every day of the week. And it doesn't work that way. Look at verse 4. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. What a powerful indictment here. May God never respond to us that way. You see, what we do on Sunday morning is not the totality of worship, is it? It has to do with what you do on Monday morning and Tuesday morning and Tuesday afternoon at work. And wherever you are, that's just as important as what you're doing right now. How we treat people, how we respond to those around us. That's what it means to live in the kingdom in every aspect of our lives. Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. But if you don't have the true ingredients of salt, if you're contaminated salt, you're just road dust, he says. A few years ago, we studied this text together, and I shared with you a tweet from a friend. And I want to show you that again this morning. Again, this was back in 2011. And my friend was referencing an article on Yahoo Sports. The article read, for 1/3 of the price of a regular ticket, NFL fans will be able to stand outside Cowboy Stadium and act like they're attending the Super Bowl. The league announced on Wednesday that you could buy tickets to watch the game on large high-def video screens on the east side of the stadium for only $200. In his tweet, my friend said, $200 to stand outside Dallas Stadium so you can act like you're attending the game. Analogy to some church life we know? Wow, that's powerful, isn't it? That's what we're doing sometimes. We're pretending, we're acting like we're living for Christ. All the while, we have no impact in our world. And Jesus responds, pretenders will not be a part of the kingdom. Pretenders will not have impact. In fact, pretenders will do more damage to the kingdom if they're desalted salt, right? Or salt that has lost its saltiness. He continues in verse 14 there. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Now, you've heard this text before, haven't you? Maybe you grew up in Vacation Bible School singing the song, did you? This little what? Light of mine. And I'm not like Matt. I can't sing in my sermons. If I did, you would probably not want me to anymore. So, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. And then what would we do? We would hold our finger up and we would put our hands over it. Hide it under a bushel. We would scream, no, I'm going to let it shine. We'd say it again. Hide it under a bushel. No, I'm going to let it shine. And then we would all sing in unison, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Anybody ever sing that song? Yeah. What do we mean by that? Well, as a kid, we probably didn't even really understand it, did we? What were we talking about? The light shining. Do you remember Jesus saying in John, I am the light of the world, right? But here he says, you are the light of the world. Well, which one is it? It's both, right? Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. What is light? Light is something that brings goodness, hope, light to darkness, right? And Jesus is that light, but we are told here that we are going to be that light. I think this also ties into what Paul wrote to the Philippians. Philippians chapter 2, Paul said this, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation in which you shine like stars in the universe. Do you know, when Paul wrote that, I'm not sure he understood exactly the astrology and how the whole deal worked out, but we understand today that stars really have no light in and of themselves, do they? They are merely reflections of the what? The sun, exactly. The sun is the source of the light. But when the sun shines on the star shines. I think that's what Jesus is getting at here. Jesus is saying, I'm the light of the world, but now you're going to be the light of the world. I'm going to shine on you, and you're going to reflect me in all you do. I think that's what he's saying here. We are light because Jesus is light. And then he gives us a practical example here. He says, when you light a lamp, you don't hide it under, and the word bushel is used sometimes there, but what's a bushel, right? Other translations say a meal tub or a bucket or a bowl even, right? You don't light a lamp and then put a bowl over it. That would make no sense at all. What do? You take it and you put it on a stand so that it can illuminate the darkness around it, right? And light is very powerful. If we were in here this morning and we were able to seal up all the windows, and I would light just a small candle, it would illuminate this whole room. Maybe you remember on Christmas Eve, right? Just one light can fill this enormous room. That's what it's like. And Jesus says the same thing there. Our light has the potential to impact everything around it. And then he says in verse 16, in the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. That they may see your, what? Good deeds, works. Ergon is the Greek word there. It is translated as works sometimes. What we do reflects what? The Father, you see. And that's why our light has impact. What we do matters. Now, two analogies here. Salt and light. Jesus tells us that we are to be salt and light. He's defined the kingdom values, and he's told us we are to live in these values. And if we do so, we will be salt and light in the world around us. And our works will shine the light of the Father, right? Now, you might hear this and you might go, well, there's some tension here between works and what we do and what God has done, right? Because we say often around here, it's not about what you do. Your works do not earn you salvation. It's about what He has done. And we receive that grace, but at the same time we see here the word ergon, the word works, and we understand that our works are important, right? And our works often reflect the Father. And so it is also about what we do. How we live matters, Jesus says. Light is a word that describes truth and good. And so when our works reflect the Father, we are living as we should, right? We're treating people like they need to be treated. We're responding with patience. We're bringing truth into dark places. And if we don't do that, if our works, if our actions, how we live is not consistent with Christ, then we're like street dust, Jesus says. We're like light hidden under a bowl. You see, that's what we look like. So, in our offices, in our schools, in our dorms, in our workplaces, sporting events, in a coffee shop, in conversation with people, as we drive around town, as we do the work of our lives, as we stand in line at Walmart, right? Everything that we do, we have the potential to be salt and light in our world. I'm going to ask Anna, my daughter Anna, to come and share this morning. She and Kayla, where's Kayla? There's Kayla back there. She and Kayla have done something in their high school, and I think that it speaks to what it means to be salt and light in the world. And so I want them to share a little bit about that, and then we'll finish talking about this morning.
Hi. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Anna Allen. My dad asked me to share about something that my friend Kayla and I have done in our school. And basically, we started a club that reaches out to special needs students that is basically to bridge that gap that often separates them from like the mainstream public high school life, which, as all of you guys know, is often a very tough thing in general, especially for these kids that just have a hard time with like acceptance and all that stuff. We have been to Camp Barnabas, as most of you guys know. We've shared about that as well. It's a summer camp for special needs, and we kind of got the inspiration for it from that and getting to know those kids that go there and just seeing how awesome they were, but that what they had to go home to wasn't as accepting as Camp Barnabas was for them. So we wanted to mimic this in a way that would be everyday and hopefully change the way they feel about themselves and their school and just everything, because it's tough and we've seen that. So I asked Kayla to help me, and we went straight to our principal, who loved the idea. We knew that we had a lot of advantages in starting this because we knew a lot of people, we knew a lot of teachers, and just a lot of networking that we knew we can make this happen. So we talked to the corporation, and they also loved the idea. And within probably less than a month, we had a Christmas party up and running. We had about 30 helpers, which actually was less than the people that signed up. We couldn't have all the people that signed up because it would be an overwhelming amount of people, which was a good thing, but we had to kind of narrow it down a little. So we had people sign up and do that, and probably about 10 of the special needs students came, which was basically all of them. We had like games and like crafts and all that kind of stuff. And it was just a really good experience for everyone, whether it was the special needs students themselves or us or the other students that helped out, the teachers, just even the people that weren't even participating in it. You could tell, saw what was going on and they thought it was cool. So it was a lot less intimidating than we thought it would be. We thought, oh, this is so scary, we have to go to the corporation, but really it wasn't. It was just that first step that just took the gut to do that. So we realized that there was a lot of support, and we also realized that if you start something like that, people will jump on board and support you more than you might expect. So before the first event, I was at a basketball game, and I saw one of the boys there. His name's Michael, and I was just like, hey, Michael, are you going to be at the Christmas party? We're looking forward to seeing you there and stuff. And his dad was with him, and he asked me if I was one of the girls that had started it, and I answered yes. And he just genuinely thanked me for what we were doing. And I could just tell that not only did it influence this one boy, but also his family and just the way they saw things. Because whenever you have a child with special needs, it doesn't just affect the child, it affects the whole family, obviously. So that just kind of really motivated me that, hey, keep going, because it's not just one person or two people that you're influencing, it's a lot of people. So it had a ripple effect, basically. And this is still evident. I can see people want to sit with them at lunch, or they want to work in their classroom, or this or that. And although you can't just say, oh, that's all because of Project Us, but a lot of it, I think, is because it kind of opened people's eyes to that and just got people to see how much fun they were and how much fun you could have, and all that stuff. So basically, it's just that first leap of courage that it took for us to get that started, step outside our comfort zone, and basically, it'll all take over from there. So I encourage you guys to take that first leap as well. If there's something that you care about, just embrace that and use that, and God will use you in the process.
Thank you for sharing that, Anna. I see Daniel here and Kayla and others who are involved in that club, and that is a way to be salt and light, right? They're not bringing a big Bible into school and popping it down on the lunch table, but they're serving through their works, right? And their actions, and it's reflecting the Father. You see, when you care for those who are disabled, you're reflecting the Father, aren't you? You're being stars shining in the universe. You're being salt, preserving and cleaning and bringing purity to a dark world. You see, you're being light where there is no light, you see. So maybe this morning, God would be prompting you in some way to be salt and light. You see, church is not just about coming here on Sunday morning. You should come here on Sunday morning to be equipped to live the rest of the week. On your mission field, in your mission field, exactly where God has placed you. Before we close this morning, I want to just highlight one more point this morning. And this is that we need to realize that our light and our saltiness comes from the King, right? It's not on our own. We can't manufacture this. It's not something that we can do. It only comes through the power of Jesus as He works in us and as we reflect Him back. Paul wrote to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, "For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear, and with much trembling." You know, I just pause there a minute because some of you, to be salt and light in your world, that scares you to death, doesn't it? Weakness and fear and trembling. But look what he says. "My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power." You see, this, I think, takes the pressure off us, doesn't it? To be salt and light in our world is simply to tap into the power that He's already given us, right? It's simply to say to God each and every day, "God, I'll be faithful. Wherever you put me, I just want to be faithful. I just want to reflect you back in whatever I do." I wonder this morning how God might be speaking to us this morning. And I ask you the question, are you in a place in life where people would say of you, "There's really nothing different about him or her and everybody else"? Or are you in a place in your work, in your life, where people would look at you and maybe they fully understand it, but they would say, "There's something different about that person. There's something in them that is not in everybody else." And maybe God would use you to be salt and light in the world. Would our actions proclaim the love and grace of Jesus? Or are we like Jack, faking it? Are we like the fake Super Bowl attenders, standing outside the stadium, right? Just peering at the game on the TV, telling all our friends we went to Dallas, right? Where are we? Maybe this morning God would be prompting some of us to respond to His word this morning by saying, "I want to be salt and light in my world." Maybe God would be prompting us to leave the safety and comfort of this room with our faith and take it to our workplaces, to take it to our families, to take it to the places where we live the other 7 days of the week. Would you pray with me this morning? God, thank you for the challenge of this text this morning. The challenge to be authentic. The challenge to have an impact in the world in which we live. God, as we sing this next song, may you speak to each and every one of our hearts. May you speak truth to us. May you unveil in our life what you're calling us to do. And may we be obedient and responsive to that. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. This morning we come to this time in worship where it's an opportunity for you to respond. And as the band comes forward to sing, you're invited to stand and sing. And maybe this morning you'd want to come to the altar and pray privately. You're invited to do that. I'm going to be standing down front if there's a decision that you'd like to make, if you'd like to join this church. If you, like Sarah, would like to be baptized, this would be the time that you would come. So let's all stand together.